My name is Riley Hunt, and my preferred topic is long-term physical effects of childhood trauma in late adulthood. I think this topic is only recently being studied and still has many unknown variables and questions that are left unanswered. I want to give a trigger warning before I continue. I will briefly mention sexual abuse, physical abuse, verbal abuse, and other adverse experiences, but because that is the main topic of this presentation, I just want to give a warning for that. Let's start off with outlining what is considered childhood abuse, which relates back to chapters we previously covered during this semester. Childhood abuse is actions committed against anyone during brain development and under adolescent years. This can range from physical, sexual, verbal, financial, or power abuse, like withholding funds, cutting children off financially, especially when they do something that they don't like, as a means of punishment. And this is basically more so in their teenage years. Household dysfunction, like parents are always fighting, people are constantly moving due to negative reasons, strangers might be coming in and out of the household. I also want to mention that other adverse events, like the absence of a parent, being raised by a teen, or being a teen mother, can also create trauma, especially to the body. A link between childhood abuse and physical health. A quick look at how trauma is related to health is the term post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD for short. I do want to mention that the younger the generation, we are typically more inclusive on what we put into the word trauma. For older generations, this is just a stereotype. This is not to put everyone in a box, but typically they will only categorize those who have gone to war, such as veterans, can only have PTSD, which is not true. There are other things that can create trauma. This is basically just historically a cultural thing. There is also the mind-to-body theory connection, and it states that your body remembers everything, even when your brain forgets. It also alters your hormones and stress mechanisms, and we can dive a little bit into that later. And just like adverse events, there are other external factors which I cannot go into because I will not have enough time, but it's basically just chemical exposure, or these are examples like chemical exposures, such as kids who live next to a paper mill, those who live in a polluted city, high AQIs, air quality index, these still impact your physical and mental health. Physical effects in late adulthood, basically just getting into the more scientific portion of it. So a neurological dysfunction, this is basically a little bit about how it affects your brain during childhood abuse. So the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the HPA axis, is going to be interconnected with the sympathetic nervous system, which that is the initial and rapid response, while the HPA is longer lasting. Typically, abuse, especially extensive abuse, leads to an hyperactive HPA axis. Cortisol levels are going to be elevated, or a hypoactive HPA. Cortisols are suppressed, and both of these lead to changing in both resting and response levels to stress. And cortisol is basically just the stress hormone because it regulates blood sugar, inflammation, and blood pressure. Not only that, the HPA is for your behavior and cognitive responses. A good question to ask yourself is, those who are constantly under stress, are they going to react any differently than those who are not to new forms of stress? And typically, those who are under a constant stress, or who are in constant stress during childhood, more so de-stress, they are going to gain rapid weight, or they're going to have rapid weight loss. They're going to have a lot more fatigue, cognitive despair or dysfunction, your heightened reaction centers from your sympathetic motor functions, those are all going to be altered. The brain is sensitive when you're developing, so when you're young, you're almost moldable, which what we learned in our previous chapters. Your brain is going to have a lot more time developing, and it's quick as well. Abuse can lead to overexposure of corticosteroid, a steroid. It is for immune response, inflammation, metabolism, and stress management. And there are other parts of the brain that it typically fights. So it alters the brainstem, it alters the midbrain and diencephalon, it alters the limbic system, it alters the cortex, which is all important for growing, especially as children. So chronic stress, basically there's two types of stress. There's de-stress and eustress. Eustress is your good stress. We want that kind of stress. It's basically putting small goals and being able to achieve there. It can be exercise, riding a roller coaster because it gives you a thrill. You're a little bit stressed, but you're still good, you're safe. This is more important for resilience and personal growth. Eustress for cognitive development, age-related memory loss. There's things like intellectual stimulation. So for the geriatric population, they have book clubs where they're able to read new ideas, they're gaining new information, they're stimulating the brain in a healthy way. But unfortunately, toxic stress, de-stress, is going to be a lot more harmful and is linked to physiological dysregulation and inflammation, especially in formative years, and it can create more health issues. The body under constant stress will naturally weaken in its repair and regenerative processes, which again, once that is weakened, it is harder to become healthy again, which accelerates the negative cycle of stress and susceptibility to illnesses. So how does abuse alter changes in the geriatric population? So trauma in forms of any abuse during childhood years creates a higher risk of cognitive impairment and decline for the geriatric population. And this is heightened if they continuously live in cycles of abuse, such as living with family members who have caused harm continuously or have stopped previously, but they used to cause harm, being with an abusive partner, or in a toxic work or home environment. These all excel the chances of developing cognitive impairments in older individuals as well. And this stems from, again, the neurological changes that happened during previous years. And more importantly, it's going to change cognitive function that comes with aging naturally. And so memory, attention, executive function is going to decrease. There's going to also be a higher chance of developing impairments such as Alzheimer's or dementia. And a good question is, how might differences in access to healthcare between individuals with childhood trauma and those without it can impact the severity of physical impairments in older adults? And again, those who do not have access to healthcare are again going to create that negative cycle of disrepair. So, what does all that mean for long-term consequences, especially after decades and decades of that trauma building up with the body and the body remembering that, especially for the senior population? So, neurological and psychological development processes will be altered. They will have an increased risk of chronic illness, cognitive impairment, immune system dysfunction, physical manifestations, such as a main example is chronic pain and fatigue, or even GI issues. But more importantly, if you ever hear someone who has just lived a very stressful life, if they say, I'm always tired, I'm always in pain, this is more likely why. A good example is that after finals, typically students become sick due to high stress levels, and unfortunately the geriatric population has already extreme health changes and has a weakened immune system, and with such a weak immune response, this can increase morbidity rates because their bodies are already susceptible. And so this data is from an article written by Monat S., which studied the long-term physical health consequences of childhood experiences. The control variable, you could say, are those who did not suffer from trauma, and this is basically comparing the two. They took a mediation test, and you can see that for these examples, the ones I wanted to point out was there's an 89% chance or change with mental health and behaviors when there is sexual abuse in childhood. So you are more likely to have extreme health related issues or self related health issues if you had sexual abuse as a kid. And there's also the same for if you had physical abuse, you're going to have a 89% in chance risk of diabetes. So, coping and management. Coping skills, unfortunately, because years of abuse, many people create maladaptive habits. Maladaptive habits are basically just negative or bad habits. This includes overeating, substance abuse, alcohol abuse. It can also be considered gambling as well. There are many ways to create bad habits just for emotional relief. And it's hard to point fingers on saying why, like, hey, you can't do this or you shouldn't do this, when it is a good emotional relief, especially for someone who had long-term abuse and needed a coping mechanism skill. And this is just a mixture of stress responses, mental disorders, especially families who have a history of mental disorders, lack of mobility due to sedentary lifestyles, and it's just from decades of poorly built habits. And this can also happen during college years, adult years. They have a poor sleep schedule, they don't have good nutrition, they don't exercise as much, and again, this again continues the negative cycle. And where does it stem from? This stems from a lack of education, a lack of social support, different societal standards. The geriatric population is going to have an extreme, differently set of cultural norms than the younger generation. They sometimes it is not believed in getting therapy or getting help. Some people don't believe they have trauma. There's high costs, external factors. They might live in with a big family. They may not have time. They don't have a car, or they can't get there. Lack of positive reinforcements from parents. If you were abused as a kid, you are not going to get a positive reinforcement or a positive role model. We also don't have many social support systems for the geriatric population because they're such a rapidly growing group. Conclusion, just a quick summary and my references. A quick summary. So basically, through childhood abuse, it creates extreme health implications that last a lifetime, and especially with the geriatric population, they have lived decades. They have a lot of life experiences, and it just builds up over time. And especially with the weakened immunity just due to natural aging processes, rapid health changes, and increased susceptibility, those traumas, past traumas, are going to increase those risks. And with new evidence, I think it's important for health care providers and public health indicators to reduce health disparities. And we want to create healthy habits, a good community, and medical care, especially for the younger generation as well, because we all go through the same cycle. For approaching this as just regular community members, we approach those with empathy. We do not know what goes on in their lifestyle or what has gone in their life. We cannot point the fingers at them for what has happened to them, and we cannot blame them for their coping mechanism skills. I think that's an important one. It should be very hard to find blame, but we want to approach with education and empathy to create new healthy habits for them. These are my references, and if you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you.